She walked out of that courtroom holding her daughter's hand, smiling for the cameras like she'd just won something. But 3 days later, both of them were gone. What happened in those 72 hours would become one of the most disturbing mysteries Pennsylvania had ever seen, not because of what was done, but because of who did it and why no one saw it coming. Welcome to True Crime Headquarters. Tonight, we explore 5 unsettling stories where appearances concealed something far darker. Take a moment to settle in. Breathe slowly. Let the outside world fade. This is the story of the Anna Jean Kane case. Now let's begin. Tonight, we're going back to 1994. To a small Pennsylvania town where everyone knew everyone, where front doors stayed unlocked, and where a woman named Anna Jean Kane was trying to rebuild her life after a difficult divorce. This isn't a story about a stranger in the shadows or a random act of violence. This is about something far more unsettling. It's about the people we trust most, the ones who sit across from us at dinner tables, the ones who tuck children into bed at night. What happened to Anna Jean and her daughter Stephanie happened in plain sight, in a home that should have been the safest place in the world. And when investigators finally pieced together what occurred in that basement, they realized they were dealing with something they'd never encountered before. If you enjoy listening and would like to find this channel again, you're welcome to subscribe. So let's go back to Lackawanna County. Back to a custody battle that should have ended quietly. Back to the moment when everything went terribly, impossibly wrong. 1994 was supposed to be Anna Jean Kane's year of new beginnings. She was 34 years old, living in the quiet borough of Factoryville, Pennsylvania, a place where the population barely reached 1,200 souls. The kind of town where Friday night football games drew the whole community, where church bells marked the rhythm of the week, and where most families had deep roots going back generations. Anna Jean had recently finalized her divorce from Michael Kane. Hadn't been easy. Divorces rarely are, especially in small towns where everyone has an opinion and gossip travels faster than newspaper headlines. But she'd pushed through it, determined to create a stable life for her 6-year-old daughter, Stephanie. Stephanie was the center of Anna Jean's world. Blonde-haired, bright-eyed, full of the kind of energy that fills a house with laughter and occasional chaos. She was in first grade at the local elementary school, where teachers described her as sweet-natured and curious, always raising her hand to answer questions, always eager to help classmates who struggled with their lessons. The custody arrangement had been contentious. Michael wanted joint custody. Anna Jean had fought for primary custody, and she'd won. The court had granted her full physical custody of Stephanie, with Michael receiving visitation rights. It was a bitter pill for him to swallow, but the judge had made the decision based on what they believed was in Stephanie's best interest. Michael Kane wasn't a monster, at least not in the obvious ways. He worked as a mechanic, had no criminal record, paid his child support on time. To neighbors and acquaintances, he seemed like a regular guy dealing with the pain of divorce and reduced access to his daughter. He lived with his mother, Mary and Kane, in a modest 2-story house on a tree-lined street not far from where Anna Jean had settled with Stephanie. Mary was in her late 50s, a woman who'd raised Michael as a single mother after her husband left when Michael was young. She'd worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table, had sacrificed endlessly for her son. By all accounts, she was devoted to him in that fierce, protective way that some mothers are. The kind of devotion that doesn't always leave room for objectivity. The custody battle had driven a wedge between the 2 households. Anna Jean and Mary had never gotten along particularly well even during the marriage, but after the divorce, whatever civility had existed evaporated completely. Mary made no secret of her belief that Anna Jean had stolen Stephanie away from Michael. She told anyone who would listen that the court system was biased against fathers, that Anna Jean had manipulated the judge, that her son was being treated unfairly. In early March of 1994, things came to a head. Michael had filed a motion to modify the custody arrangement, claiming that Anna Jean was interfering with his visitation rights. She'd allegedly made it difficult for him to see Stephanie, canceling visits at the last minute, making excuses about Stephanie being sick or having other plans. Anna Jean denied these accusations, saying that she'd honored every scheduled visitation and that Michael was the one who'd missed several visits without explanation. The case went before Judge Chester B. Murawski in Lackawanna County Court on March 21st. It was supposed to be a routine hearing, the kind of post-divorce skirmish that family court judges handle every week. Both parties presented their evidence. Michael's attorney argued that Anna Jean was engaging in parental alienation, trying to drive a wedge between father and daughter. Anna Jean's attorney countered that Michael had a pattern of unreliability and that Anna Jean had meticulously documented every missed visit, every late pickup, every broken promise. Judge Murawski listened to both sides. He reviewed the documentation, and in the end, he ruled in Anna Jean's favor. The custody arrangement would remain as it was. Michael's visitation rights were confirmed but not expanded. Anna Jean retained full physical custody. It was a clear victory for Anna Jean, and she walked out of that courtroom visibly relieved. She held Stephanie's hand as they descended the courthouse steps. A local newspaper photographer happened to be there covering another case, and he snapped a photo of mother and daughter leaving together. In the picture, Anna Jean is smiling, her shoulders relaxed for perhaps the first time in months. Stephanie is looking up at her mother, her small hand wrapped tightly around Anna Jean's fingers. That photograph would later haunt everyone who saw it, because it captured a moment of peace that wouldn't last. Michael Caine left the courthouse looking defeated, his mother at his side. Witnesses later recalled that Mary and seemed furious, her face flushed, her movements sharp and agitated. She was overheard saying something to Michael as they reached their car, but no one was close enough to make out the words. Over the next 3 days, life continued its normal rhythm. Anna Jean went to work at her job as a secretary at a local insurance office. Stephanie went to school, came home, did her homework at the kitchen table while Anna Jean prepared dinner. They had a routine, and routines are supposed to provide safety, predictability, comfort. On the evening of March 24th, Anna Jean spoke with her sister on the phone. The conversation lasted about 20 minutes. Anna Jean mentioned that she was planning to take Stephanie to the park that weekend if the weather held. She sounded happy, her sister would later tell investigators. Relieved that the custody battle was finally behind them. That was the last confirmed conversation Anna Jean had with anyone outside her home. March 25th was a Friday. Stephanie didn't show up at school. The attendance office called Anna Jean's house several times throughout the day but got no answer. They tried her work number. Nothing. It wasn't entirely unusual for a parent to keep a sick child home without calling the school first thing in the morning. So the attendance secretary made a note to follow up on Monday if the absence continued. But Anna Jean didn't show up for work either. Her supervisor called her house repeatedly. The phone rang and rang. Eventually, it went to voicemail. Concerned, the supervisor called Anna Jean's sister, thinking perhaps there'd been a family emergency. Anna Jean's sister immediately felt a chill of worry. Anna Jean was reliable to a fault. She never missed work without calling. She never kept Stephanie home from school without informing the office. Something was wrong. By Saturday morning, Anna Jean's sister had moved from worried to frightened. She'd driven past Anna Jean's house 3 times on Friday evening, each time seeing the curtains drawn and no signs of movement inside. Anna Jean's car was in the driveway. The lights were off. Everything looked eerily still. She'd knocked on the door, called through the mail slot, even walked around to the back of the house and tapped on the kitchen window. Nothing. She'd considered calling the police then, but talked herself out of it. Maybe Anna Jean and Stephanie had gotten a ride somewhere. Maybe they'd gone to visit a friend and the car had been acting up. There had to be a reasonable explanation. But by Saturday morning, with still no word, she called the Factoryville Police Department. The officer who took her call was patient but not immediately concerned. Adults have the right to come and go as they please, he explained. 48 hours hadn't even passed since the last confirmed contact. Maybe Anna Jean had decided to take a spontaneous trip with Stephanie. Maybe she'd forgotten to tell anyone. Anna Jean's sister insisted that this was completely out of character. She mentioned the recent custody battle, the tension with Michael and Mary and Kane. The officer's tone shifted slightly. He said he'd send someone over to do a welfare check. Officer Daniel Roche arrived at Anna Jean's house around 10:30 that morning. The neighborhood was quiet, peaceful. Lawns were neatly trimmed. A few children rode bicycles up and down the sidewalk. Nothing seemed amiss. He knocked on the front door. No answer. He rang the doorbell. Silence. He walked around the perimeter of the house, checking windows, looking for any signs of forced entry. Everything appeared secure and undisturbed. He was about to leave when something made him try the back door. Later, he couldn't quite explain what prompted him. Maybe it was the sister's insistence that something was wrong. Maybe it was instinct developed over years of police work. Maybe it was just luck. The back door was unlocked. He called out as he opened it, identifying himself as police, asking if anyone was home. The house remained silent. He stepped inside, immediately noticing how cold it was. The heat seemed to be off despite the March chill outside. The kitchen was clean, almost unnaturally so. No dishes in the sink. No signs of a recent meal. The whole place had an abandoned feeling, as if no one had been there for days. He moved through the first floor, checking each room. Living room, dining room, bathroom. All empty, all eerily neat. He climbed the stairs, his hand resting on his service weapon now. That instinctive caution that comes when something doesn't feel right. The bedrooms were empty, beds made, closets still full of clothes. Stephanie's room looked like any 6-year-old's room. Stuffed animals lined up on shelves, drawings taped to the walls, a small desk with crayons and coloring books. Nothing disturbed. He came back downstairs and stood in the kitchen, trying to decide whether to call this in as a missing persons case or simply leave a note asking Anna Jean to contact the police department when she returned. That's when he noticed the basement door, slightly ajar. Pennsylvania basements in old houses like this one are typically unfinished. Concrete floors, exposed beams, the kind of space used for storage and laundry and not much else. Officer Roche opened the door wider and called down the stairs. His voice echoed in the darkness below. He found the light switch and descended. What he discovered at the bottom of those stairs would change everything. Would transform this from a simple welfare check into one of the most disturbing criminal investigations Lackawanna County had ever seen. Anna Jean Kane and her daughter Stephanie were there, in the basement, and they weren't coming back up. Officer Roche immediately called for backup and sealed the scene. Within an hour, the small house on that quiet Factoryville street was swarming with investigators. The county coroner was summoned. The district attorney's office was notified. Yellow crime scene tape went up around the property, and neighbors began gathering on the sidewalk, murmuring to each other, trying to understand what had happened. The medical examiner who responded that day was Dr. William Lissman, a man who'd performed autopsies in Lackawanna County for nearly 20 years. He'd seen violent deaths before, had examined bodies in every state of trauma and decomposition. But when he descended those basement stairs, even he felt the weight of what lay before him. Anna Jean and Stephanie had been deceased for approximately 24 to 36 hours, based on the state of decomposition and the temperature of the basement. Both had died from asphyxiation. There were no signs of a struggle, no defensive wounds on Anna Jean's hands or arms, no evidence that either had fought back against their attacker. And that was the detail that immediately struck investigators as profoundly disturbing. How do you asphyxiate a healthy 34-year-old woman and her 6-year-old daughter without signs of struggle? Without noise that would alert neighbors? Without anything being knocked over or broken? The positioning of the bodies suggested they'd been moved after death. Anna Jean was lying on her side, almost as if sleeping. Stephanie was beside her, positioned in a way that looked deliberately peaceful, as if someone had carefully arranged them. But there was one detail that made every investigator in that basement feel a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Stephanie was holding her favorite stuffed animal, a worn teddy bear that normally lived on her bed upstairs. Someone had gone up to her room, retrieved that bear, and placed it in the little girl's arms after she died. That single detail told them everything they needed to know about who they were looking for. This wasn't a stranger. This wasn't a random home invasion. This was someone who knew Stephanie well enough to know which stuffed animal she loved most. Someone who had access to the house. Someone who cared, in their own twisted way, about making sure Stephanie looked peaceful. The forensics team processed the scene with meticulous care. They photographed every inch of the basement, collected fiber samples, dusted for fingerprints. They found several partial prints on the railing of the basement stairs, on the back door handle, on a light switch near the basement entrance. When those prints were run through the database, they got two matches. One set belonged to Anna Jean herself, which made sense, it was her house. The other set belonged to Mary and Kane. The timeline investigators were building was becoming clearer. Anna Jean and Stephanie had last been seen leaving the courthouse on March 21st. They'd definitely been alive on the evening of March 24th when Anna Jean spoke with her sister. Sometime between Thursday night and Friday morning, someone had entered their home and ended both their lives. Detectives went to the Kane house that same afternoon. Mary and Kane answered the door herself. She looked tired, older than her 58 years. When Detective Frank Morrison identified himself and said he needed to ask some questions about Anna Jean and Stephanie Kane, Marion's face didn't register surprise or confusion. She simply nodded and invited them inside. Her son Michael was at work, she explained. Would they like coffee? The detectives declined. Detective Morrison is a careful man, someone who'd worked homicide cases for 15 years and learned the value of patience. He didn't immediately accuse. He simply asked Mary and when she'd last seen Anna Jean and Stephanie. She said it had been weeks ago, maybe months. She couldn't remember exactly. She and Anna Jean didn't get along, as everyone knew. Detective Morrison nodded, made notes. Then he asked if Mary had been to Anna Jean's house recently. She hesitated. For just a fraction of a second, something flickered across her face. Then she said no, she hadn't been there in over a year. Detective Morrison looked up from his notebook. He told her they'd found her fingerprints in Anna Jean's home. Multiple prints in multiple locations, including some in the basement. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 10 seconds, but those who were there said it felt like an eternity. Then Mary and Kane began to cry. Not the desperate, shocked tears of someone falsely accused. These were different, quieter, almost relieved tears, as if she'd been carrying something impossibly heavy and was finally allowed to set it down. What she said next would be transcribed in police reports, analyzed by prosecutors, and eventually read aloud in a courtroom. But the essence of it was this. She'd done what any mother would do. She'd protected her son. The full confession took hours. Marion described how the court ruling had devastated Michael, how he'd come home from that hearing looking broken, how she couldn't stand to see him in such pain. She believed Anna Jean had stolen his daughter, believed the court system was rigged against fathers, believed that Michael was suffering an injustice that needed to be corrected. On Thursday night, March 24th, while Michael was working a late shift at the garage, Mary had driven to Anna Jean's house. She'd used a key that Michael still had from when he'd lived there, a key Anna Jean didn't know he'd kept. She'd let herself in through the back door while Anna Jean and Stephanie were watching television in the living room. Anna Jean had been shocked to see her, had immediately asked what she was doing there. Marion said she'd wanted to talk, to discuss Stephanie's future, to work something out like reasonable adults. Anna Jean, perhaps wanting to avoid a scene with Stephanie present, had agreed to talk in the kitchen. The details of what happened next are difficult to recount. Even now, even speaking softly in the darkness like this, Mary had brought something with her, something she'd planned to use. She wasn't impulsive or disorganized. This had been premeditated. She'd thought it through. While they talked in the kitchen, Stephanie had stayed in the living room watching cartoons. Mary had suggested they continue the conversation in the basement where they wouldn't disturb Stephanie. Anna Jean, perhaps not yet sensing real danger, had agreed. In the basement, Mary had acted quickly. She'd brought a plastic bag. She'd used it to cut off Anna Jean's air supply, holding it over her head while Anna Jean struggled. But Mary was strong from decades of physical labor, and she'd had the element of surprise. Anna Jean had lost consciousness within minutes and died shortly after. Then Mary Ann had gone back upstairs. She'd found Stephanie still watching television, completely unaware. She'd told the little girl that her mother wasn't feeling well and needed to rest in the basement. Would Stephanie come downstairs with her to check on Mommy? What happened next haunts everyone who learned about this case. Stephanie had trustingly taken Mary Ann's hand, had walked down those basement stairs with the woman she'd known as her grandmother. And there, seeing her mother lying on the floor, Stephanie had started to scream. Mary Ann said she tried to comfort Stephanie, had tried to explain that everything would be okay, that grandmother was here to help. But Stephanie wouldn't stop screaming. Mary Ann had panicked. She'd used the same method on Stephanie that she'd used on Anna Jean. She'd held the bag over the child's face until Stephanie stopped struggling. Then she'd arranged them both carefully. She'd gone upstairs to Stephanie's room and retrieved the teddy bear. She'd turned off most of the lights in the house, locked the doors, and driven home. Michael had been asleep when she arrived. He'd never known she'd left. The confession was corroborated by physical evidence. The plastic bag was found in a dumpster 3 blocks from Mary Ann's house, contained trace DNA from both victims. Security footage from a convenience store showed Mary Ann's car passing by at 11:17 on Thursday night, heading in the direction of Anna Jean's house. Michael Caine was interviewed extensively. Investigators initially suspected he might have been involved or at least aware of his mother's plans. But every piece of evidence indicated he'd known nothing. He'd been at work during the murders, confirmed by time cards and multiple witnesses. When detectives told him what his mother had done, he'd collapsed. He'd sobbed. He'd asked over and over how this could have happened, how his mother could have done such a thing. Mary Ann Caine was arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. Because Pennsylvania had the death penalty at the time, and because one victim was a child, prosecutors initially considered seeking capital punishment. But after psychiatric evaluations revealed severe delusional thinking related to her son, they accepted a plea agreement. Mary Ann Caine was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms without possibility of parole. She never expressed remorse, not in the way most people understand it. She maintained that she'd done what was necessary, that she'd been protecting her son from an unjust system, that Anna Jean had left her no choice. In prison, she became a model inmate, quiet and compliant. She died there in 2009, 15 years into her sentence, from complications related to cancer. She was 73 years old. Michael Caine moved away from Pennsylvania shortly after his mother's trial concluded. He changed his name legally, started over somewhere else. No one knows where he is now, and most people believe that's for the best. He lost his daughter, his ex-wife, and his mother all within a span of months. Whatever life he built afterward, he built from ashes. The house where Anna Jean and Stephanie died stood empty for several years. Eventually it was sold, renovated, sold again. New families have lived there, unaware of what happened in the basement or perhaps knowing but choosing not to dwell on it. Life moves forward. It has to. But in Factoryville, people remember. The older residents especially. They remember Anna Jean and Stephanie. They remember the shock of discovering that sometimes the most dangerous person isn't a stranger but someone you've known for years. Someone who sits beside you in church. Someone who waves hello at the grocery store. The case changed how family courts in Pennsylvania handled high-conflict custody situations. New protocols were put in place to assess potential danger from extended family members, not just parents. Judges began asking different questions, looking for warning signs that might have prevented what happened to Anna Jean and Stephanie. Their graves are in a small cemetery outside of town. Mother and daughter buried side by side under a shared headstone. People still leave flowers there even now, 30 years later, especially in March around the anniversary. Small bouquets, teddy bears, notes written by strangers who never knew them but who feel the weight of their story. Because that's what stays with you from a case like this. Not the violence itself, but the betrayal, the perversion of maternal love into something monstrous. The way someone could hold a child's hand and lead her to her death while believing they were doing the right thing. If you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we dive into true crime stories with calmness and respect. A special shout out to my amazing subscribers who've been with me from the start. Thank you for your incredible support. If you're still with me, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Or just say hello so I know you're still here. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and hit subscribe so you won't miss any of our upcoming true crime stories perfect for winding down. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. The Familiar Stranger. The Fawn Marie Cox Case. There are moments when evil doesn't announce itself with thunder. Sometimes it arrives on an ordinary afternoon, wearing a familiar face, speaking words that sound almost kind. In 1993, a young woman in Florida learned this truth in the worst possible way. What happened to her would expose not just one person's capacity for darkness, but the fragile threads that separate safety from horror in our everyday lives. This is the story of Fawn Marie Cox. Next tonight, we're going to explore another case that reminds us how quickly normalcy can shatter. This isn't a story designed to shock you awake, but rather one that unfolds slowly, like fog rolling across still water. It's about trust misplaced, warning signs missed, and a community forced to confront uncomfortable questions about the people living among them. The events we'll discuss tonight are real. The people were real. The pain was real. We'll handle this story with the care it deserves, focusing not on sensationalism, but on understanding how tragedy unfolds and what it leaves behind. So, find a comfortable position if you have already, and listen as we piece together what happened during those critical days in Florida, more than 3 decades ago. Florida in the early 1990s carried a particular energy. The state was experiencing rapid growth, with new developments spreading across formerly rural areas. Strip malls appeared where orange groves once stood. Highways expanded to accommodate the endless flow of newcomers seeking sunshine and opportunity. It was a time of transition, when old Florida and new Florida existed side by side, not always comfortably. Fawn Marie Cox was 23 years old in the spring of 1993. She had the kind of life that many young people dream about during those uncertain years after childhood ends but before true independence begins. She worked as a waitress, a job that required patience, quick thinking, and the ability to read people. Those who knew her described someone friendly and outgoing, the type of person who could make conversation with anyone. She had dreams, plans, the normal architecture of a life under construction. The community where Fawn lived reflected that transitional quality of early 90s Florida. It wasn't a large city with urban anonymity, nor was it a small town where everyone knew everyone's business. It occupied that in-between space, large enough for privacy, small enough that people recognized faces. Neighborhoods mixed longtime residents with recent arrivals. Strip malls and chain restaurants had begun to dominate the commercial landscape, but you could still find traces of old Florida if you knew where to look. William Joseph Kelly was 30 years old that spring. On the surface, nothing about him suggested the darkness that lived beneath. He had a job, an apartment, the external markers of a functional adult life. People who encountered him casually wouldn't have seen red flags. He could be charming when he wanted to be. He knew how to present himself as trustworthy, even kind. But those who knew him better, who had spent significant time in his presence, sometimes noticed things that didn't quite fit. Small inconsistencies in his stories. Moments when his expression would go flat, when something cold would flicker behind his eyes before the mask slipped back into place. The way he talked about women sometimes, as though they were objects rather than people. These weren't the kinds of things that prompted action, just uncomfortable feelings quickly dismissed or forgotten. This is one of the unsettling truths about cases like this. The people who commit terrible acts don't usually look like monsters. They look like us. They shop at the same stores, eat at the same restaurants, navigate the same daily routines. They've learned to mimic normalcy well enough to move through society without triggering alarm. It's only later, after everything falls apart, that people look back and see the pattern they missed in real time. Fawn and Kelly's paths crossed in the ordinary way that lives intersect in communities of a certain size. They weren't strangers, but they weren't close friends either. They existed in overlapping social circles, the kind where you might see someone at various places, exchange pleasantries, develop a casual acquaintance without ever really knowing them. This casual familiarity created a false sense of safety. When someone isn't a complete stranger, we lower our guard slightly. We operate on the assumption that mutual acquaintances provide a kind of social vouching, that danger comes from the unknown rather than the familiar. This assumption, while understandable, can be dangerous. As spring turned toward summer in 1993, both Fawn and Kelly moved through their separate lives, unaware that those lives were about to intersect in a catastrophic way. Fawn went to work, spent time with friends, made plans for the future. Kelly maintained his facade of normalcy while something darker took shape in his mind. The exact sequence of events that led to their fatal encounter involves details that only Kelly truly knows. What we can piece together from evidence and testimony suggests that he began to fixate on Fawn. Whether this obsession developed gradually or seized him suddenly, we cannot say with certainty. What matters is that at some point, he stopped seeing her as a person and began seeing her as something else. An object, a fantasy, target. The weather during those days was typical for Florida in late spring. Hot, humid, the kind of heat that made the air feel thick and made everyone move a little slower. Afternoon thunderstorms rolled through with predictable regularity, violent and brief, leaving everything steaming in their wake. Life continued its normal rhythm. People went to work, came home, made dinner, watched television, slept, woke up, and did it all again. Fawn had no reason to believe that her life was in danger. Nothing in her daily experience suggested that she needed to be afraid. This is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of cases like this. The victims go about their lives with normal concerns, normal worries, completely unaware that someone nearby has decided their fate. On the day everything changed, Fawn went through her usual routine. She got up, got ready, went about her business. The specific details of her movements that day have been documented through investigation, but out of respect, we'll focus on what matters for understanding what happened next. At some point that day, Kelly approached her. The exact nature of their initial interaction has been established through evidence, but what matters is that he created a situation where Fawn was isolated, vulnerable, away from potential help. Whether he used deception or force to accomplish this, the result was the same. He got her alone. What happened next unfolded in a location that provided Kelly with the privacy he needed to carry out his plans without interruption. The specifics of that location aren't as important as understanding the psychological dynamic at play. Once Kelly had Fawn in a position where she couldn't escape or call for help, the mask he'd been wearing dropped completely. The investigation into what happened to Fawn Marie Cox began when she failed to show up for work and couldn't be reached by friends or family. In cases like this, there's always a terrible window of time between when someone goes missing and when their absence triggers real alarm. Hours pass, then more hours. People tell themselves there must be a simple explanation. Maybe she forgot to charge her phone. Maybe she's dealing with an emergency. Maybe there's some reasonable explanation that will make everyone feel silly for worrying. But as those hours stretched into a day, then longer, that hopeful reasoning gave way to genuine fear. People who cared about Fawn began making calls, checking with mutual friends, trying to piece together when anyone had last seen her and where she might be. The casual optimism that maybe everything was fine began to crumble. When someone files a missing person report, it sets various mechanisms in motion. Law enforcement begins the process of tracking the person's last known movements, identifying who they were with, establishing a timeline. In Fawn's case, investigators quickly began building a picture of her final day. They spoke with coworkers, friends, neighbors. They examined her apartment, looking for signs of struggle or clues about where she might have gone. They pulled phone records, checked financial transactions, did all the standard investigative work that helps establish what happened to someone who has disappeared. During this process, Kelly's name came up. Multiple people mentioned that he'd been seen in Fawn's vicinity recently. Some noted that he'd been asking about her, showing what seemed like unusual interest. The pieces began to fall into a concerning pattern. Detectives located Kelly and brought him in for questioning. This initial interview provides a fascinating glimpse into how certain individuals respond when confronted by law enforcement. Kelly presented himself as cooperative, concerned, willing to help. He had explanations for everything. Yes, he knew Fawn. Yes, he'd seen her recently, but he had no idea where she might be now. He seemed worried about her safety. Experienced investigators know that behavior like this doesn't necessarily indicate innocence or guilt. Some people act nervous when questioned by police even when they've done nothing wrong. Others can lie with perfect composure. The interview itself provided data points but not definitive answers. What did provide answers was physical evidence. Investigators executed a search warrant on Kelly's apartment and vehicle. What they found there would prove crucial to understanding what had happened to Fawn. Forensic evidence doesn't lie. It doesn't forget. It doesn't change its story. Blood evidence, fiber evidence, biological evidence, all of these things tell a story that can be read by people trained to interpret them. And the story told by the evidence found in Kelly's possession was damning. While investigators processed this evidence, they continued searching for Fawn herself. Missing person cases create a particular kind of anguish for families. Hope and dread exist simultaneously. Every phone call might be the one that brings good news or confirms the worst. Time moves differently during these periods, simultaneously too fast and too slow. The discovery of Fawn's body came after investigators, armed with information from evidence and continued questioning of Kelly, searched a specific location. The details of how she was found and the condition of her body are part of the official record, but they don't need to be recounted in detail here. What matters is that the search ended in the worst possible way. The medical examiner's report documented what had been done to Fawn, the cause of death, the injuries she sustained, the timeline of events. This information, clinical and precise, painted a picture of her final hours that was almost unbearable for those who cared about her to contemplate. Kelly had attacked Fawn in a manner that demonstrated both violence and cruelty. He had assaulted her. He had hurt her in ways that served no purpose except to cause suffering. And when he was done, he had taken her life. The evidence against Kelly became overwhelming. The forensic evidence placed him at the scene. Fawn's belongings were found in his possession. His initial lies to investigators began to fall apart under scrutiny. The timeline he tried to construct didn't match the facts. As the investigation continued, detectives uncovered additional information that provided context for Kelly's actions. They discovered that he had a history, things in his past that suggested this violence wasn't entirely without warning. There had been complaints from other women, behavior that made people uncomfortable, a pattern of escalation that, in hindsight, pointed toward something terrible. This revelation prompted difficult questions. Could this have been prevented? Were there intervention points that were missed? Did the systems designed to protect people fail in some way? These questions didn't have simple answers then, and they still don't now. The arrest of William Joseph Kelly for the murder of Fawn Marie Cox brought a certain kind of resolution to the immediate question of what happened. But it opened up new chapters filled with legal proceedings, public reaction, and a community forced to grapple with the reality that someone capable of such violence had been living among them undetected. News of the arrest spread through the community quickly. People who had known Kelly, who had interacted with him casually, had to reconcile the person they thought they knew with what he had actually done. This cognitive dissonance creates a particular kind of discomfort. It forces people to question their own judgment, their ability to perceive danger, the reliability of their instincts. Some people claimed they'd always sensed something off about Kelly. Others insisted they'd never suspected anything. Both reactions are common and both are probably honest. Human memory is unreliable, especially after traumatic events. We reconstruct our past impressions to align with current knowledge, often without realizing we're doing it. The legal process that followed Kelly's arrest unfolded over many months. The criminal justice system, whatever its flaws, operates on certain principles. The accused has rights. Evidence must be gathered properly. Procedures must be followed. This can be frustrating for those seeking quick resolution, but these safeguards exist for important reasons. The prosecution built its case methodically. They had forensic evidence. They had witness testimony. They had Kelly's own contradictory statements. They had Fawn's body and the medical examiner's findings about what had been done to her. Piece by piece, they constructed a narrative that would be presented to a jury. Kelly's defense team had the difficult task of representing someone accused of a terrible crime. Defense attorneys often face public hostility in cases like this, but their role is essential to the system functioning properly. They ensure that proper procedures are followed, that evidence is legitimate, that their clients' constitutional rights are protected. This isn't about helping guilty people escape justice, it's about ensuring the system works as intended. As the case moved toward trial, both sides engaged in the complex dance of legal maneuvering. Motions were filed. Evidence was challenged and defended. Witnesses were interviewed and prepared for testimony. The machinery of justice ground forward, slow and deliberate. For Fawn's family and friends, this period brought a different kind of suffering. The immediate shock and grief of her death gave way to the prolonged agony of seeing her life and death become the subject of legal proceedings. They had to hear details about what happened to her, details that would never leave them. They had to see the person who killed her, had to share space with him in a courtroom, had to endure the knowledge that he was still breathing while Fawn was not. The trial itself, when it finally began, drew significant public attention. Courtrooms have limited seating, but interest in cases like this always exceeds capacity. Media coverage brought details of the proceedings to a wider audience. People who never knew Fawn felt invested in seeing justice done. The prosecution presented their case first, as is standard. They called witnesses who testified about Fawn's final days. They called investigators who explained the evidence and what it demonstrated. They called forensic experts who provided technical analysis. They called the medical examiner who described Fawn's injuries and cause of death. The defense presented their case, attempting to create reasonable doubt where they could. In cases with overwhelming physical evidence, defense strategies often focus on technicalities, on challenging the reliability of forensic methods, on suggesting alternative explanations for the evidence. The specifics of their strategy in this case followed patterns common to similar trials. Kelly himself had to decide whether to testify. This is always a crucial decision in criminal trials. Testifying allows the defendant to present their version of events directly, but it also exposes them to cross-examination. Whatever Kelly and his attorneys decided, the trial moved forward toward its conclusion. Jury deliberations represent perhaps the most critical phase of any trial. 12 people, strangers brought together by chance, must review all the evidence presented and reach a unanimous decision. They must determine, beyond reasonable doubt, whether the prosecution has proven its case. The weight of this responsibility is enormous. Their decision will determine another person's fate. In Kelly's case, the jury reached their verdict after deliberations. The specifics of how long they deliberated and what their discussions entailed remain private, as is proper. But when they returned to the courtroom and the foreperson announced their decision, it was guilty. Guilty of murder. Guilty of assault. Guilty of taking Fawn Marie Cox's life and causing immeasurable suffering in the process. Sentencing followed the verdict. The judge, having heard all the evidence and the jury's decision, imposed punishment according to law. Kelly received a sentence that reflected the severity of his crimes. He would spend the rest of his life in prison, removed from society, unable to harm anyone else. For some people, this outcome represented justice. The person responsible for Fawn's death had been identified, tried, convicted, and punished. The system had worked as intended. For others, no sentence could ever feel adequate. No amount of prison time could balance the scales or bring Fawn back or undo the suffering she experienced. Both perspectives are valid. Justice in cases like this is necessarily imperfect. We cannot undo what happened. We can only respond to it within the limitations of our legal and moral frameworks. Fawn's family had to find ways to move forward while carrying the weight of their loss. They had to learn to live with the absence of someone they loved, with the knowledge of how she died, with the reality that no amount of justice would make them whole again. This is the hidden, ongoing cost of violent crime. The impact ripples outward through families and communities, creating wounds that never fully heal. More than 3 decades have passed since Fawn Marie Cox was killed. The case is closed. William Joseph Kelly is in prison, where he will remain. The immediate questions of what happened and who was responsible have been answered. But other questions linger, the kind that don't have neat resolutions. What causes someone to commit violence like this? The answer involves complex intersections of psychology, biology, environment, and choice. Some people experience terrible childhoods and never hurt anyone. Others come from seemingly normal backgrounds and commit horrific acts. We can identify risk factors and warning signs, but we cannot predict with certainty who will cross certain lines. Kelly's case prompted examination of what, if anything, could have prevented this tragedy. Were there moments when intervention might have changed the outcome? People who had uncomfortable interactions with him in the past wondered if they should have said something, done something, pushed harder for their concerns to be taken seriously. This kind of retrospective guilt is common but not necessarily productive. The signals that seem obvious in hindsight are often ambiguous in the moment. The case also raised questions about how we assess danger in our daily lives. Fawn knew Kelly casually. He wasn't a stranger lurking in shadows. He was someone embedded in the normal social fabric of the community. This uncomfortable reality challenges the simple narratives we tell ourselves about safety and danger. We want to believe that we can identify dangerous people, that some instinct or skill will alert us when someone poses a threat. But the truth is more complicated. Many people who seem perfectly normal harbor dark impulses they may never act on. Some people who seem slightly odd or uncomfortable are harmless. The ability to reliably identify who poses genuine danger remains frustratingly elusive. Fawn's death became a statistic, one of thousands of similar tragedies that occur each year. Her name appeared in databases, in research papers, in discussions about violence against women. This abstraction is necessary for studying patterns and developing policies, but it risks losing sight of the individual person at the center of the story. Fawn Marie Cox was not a statistic. She was a 23-year-old woman with dreams and plans and people who loved her. She laughed with friends. She worked hard. She had favorite songs and foods and places. She was fully human, with all the complexity and potential that implies. What happened to her cut off all that possibility. The people who knew and loved Fawn found various ways to honor her memory. Some advocated for policy changes. Some supported organizations working to prevent violence. Some simply tried to live their lives in ways that would have made her proud. Grief transforms over time, but it doesn't disappear. It becomes part of who you are, woven into the fabric of your continuing life. William Joseph Kelly's life also continues, though in drastically different circumstances. He exists in a prison cell, his freedom permanently revoked. Whether he feels remorse for what he did, whether he has found any kind of redemption or remains unchanged, we cannot know. Prison is designed to punish and incapacitate. Whether it rehabilitates depends on factors both institutional and individual. The community where these events unfolded has changed significantly in the 30-plus years since 1993. The rapid development of early 90s Florida continued. New people arrived. Old landmarks disappeared. The physical landscape transformed. But the memory of what happened lingers, carried by those who were there, passed down through stories and records. Cases like this shape communities in subtle ways. They inform how parents talk to children about safety. They influence what precautions people take. They become part of the collective memory, a reminder that terrible things can happen anywhere, that evil can wear ordinary faces, that vigilance and awareness, while not guaranteeing safety, are not paranoia. The broader questions raised by Fawn's murder remain relevant today. How do we balance the presumption of innocence with the need to take warning signs seriously? How do we create systems that protect potential victims without becoming oppressive or violating civil liberties? How do we address the root causes of violence while still holding individuals accountable for their choices? These questions don't have simple answers, which is precisely why they remain worth asking. In the end, what happened to Fawn Marie Cox is both exceptional and ordinary. Exceptional in the sense that most people never experience violence like this. Ordinary in the sense that similar tragedies occur with disturbing regularity. Each case is unique in its specific details but familiar in its broader patterns. We tell stories like this for various reasons: to remember the victims, to understand the perpetrators, to search for lessons that might prevent future tragedies, to grapple with the reality of human darkness, to remind ourselves that the world contains both tremendous beauty and terrible cruelty, and we must somehow find ways to navigate between these extremes. As you drift toward sleep tonight, you might reflect on how fragile our everyday safety really is, how it depends on countless small choices and circumstances aligning in our favor. This isn't meant to make you fearful, but rather to cultivate awareness and appreciation for the preciousness of ordinary peaceful days. Fawn Marie Cox deserved to live a long, full life. She deserved to chase her dreams, make mistakes, learn and grow, experience joy and love and all the things that make life worth living. What happened to her was wrong in a fundamental way that transcends legal definitions. It was a violation of the basic covenant that allows human society to function, the assumption that we will not deliberately harm one another. The fact that someone chose to violate that covenant, to inflict suffering for his own purposes, reminds us that civilization is not a permanent state but rather something we must continually choose and maintain. Most people make that choice every day without conscious thought. A few do not, and when they don't, the consequences ripple outward in ways both visible and hidden. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story to help you drift off to sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. The Jody Loomis case where the system fell short. On a warm September evening in 1980, a teenage girl borrowed her mother's car to meet a friend at the mall. She never made it. What happened in the hours that followed would haunt a small Washington community for decades, and the truth, when it finally surfaced, would prove more disturbing than anyone imagined. Now, we're going to talk about something that happened a long time ago, in a place where people thought they were safe. This is the kind of story that reminds us how fragile ordinary life can be, and how the worst moments often begin with the smallest, most unremarkable decisions. This is a true crime story, told carefully and respectfully. It's about a young woman named Jody Loomis, whose life was cut short in a way that defies understanding. It's about the people who loved her, the investigators who spent years searching for answers, and the darkness that can exist in places we least expect it. So take a breath, let the day go, and let's begin. In 1980, Bellevue, Washington was a city in transition. Once a quiet suburb nestled along the eastern shore of Lake Washington, it was growing rapidly, transforming from a bedroom community into something more complex. New businesses were opening, highways were expanding, the population was swelling, and with that growth came a certain anonymity, a sense that you didn't quite know everyone anymore, that the familiar rhythms of small-town life were beginning to fade. Jody Loomis was 20 years old that summer. She was the kind of person people remembered fondly, bright, warm, with an easy laugh and a kindness that seemed effortless. She had recently graduated from high school and was working part-time while figuring out what came next. Like many young people at that age, she was caught between adolescence and adulthood, between the comfort of home and the pull of independence. She lived with her mother in Bellevue. Their relationship was close, the kind of bond that forms when it's just the two of you against the world. Jody was responsible, dependable. She didn't cause trouble. She didn't take unnecessary risks. She was the kind of daughter a mother could trust. On the evening of September 21st, 1980, Jody made plans to meet a friend at the Eastgate Mall. It was a Sunday unremarkable in every way. The sun was still hanging in the sky when she left the house, the air warm with the last breath of summer. She borrowed her mother's car, a simple transaction, the kind that happens 1,000 times in 1,000 households. She said she'd be back soon. She never came home. At first, her mother wasn't overly worried. Young people lose track of time. Plans change. But as the evening stretched into night and Jody still hadn't returned, concern began to creep in. Phone calls were made. Friends were contacted. No one had seen her. No one knew where she was. By the next morning, Jody's mother reported her missing. The car, it turned out, had been found abandoned in the parking lot of the Eastgate Mall. It was locked. There were no signs of a struggle, no indication of what had happened. It was as if Jody had simply stepped out of the vehicle and disappeared. The Bellevue Police Department began their investigation immediately. Missing person cases involving young women are always treated seriously, especially when the circumstances are unclear. Detectives canvassed the area, interviewed mall employees, spoke to anyone who might have been in the parking lot that evening. They developed a timeline. Jody had left home around 6 in the evening. Her car had been found the following morning. Somewhere in that window of time, something had gone terribly wrong. But what? And where was Jody? The days that followed were agonizing for her family. Search parties were organized. Volunteers combed through nearby parks, wooded areas, any place where a young woman might have ended up, willingly or otherwise. Tips came in, as they always do, but none led anywhere concrete. The investigation was thorough, methodical, but there was frustratingly little to work with. No witnesses, no physical evidence, no clear direction. And then, on September 25th, 4 days after Jody vanished, a construction worker made a discovery that would change everything. He was working in a semi-rural area near the intersection of Southeast 8th Street and 168th Avenue Southeast, a part of Bellevue that was still relatively undeveloped. There were patches of forest, empty lots, places where the suburbs hadn't quite reached yet. It was in one of these wooded areas that he found her. Jody Loomis was dead. Her body had been left in the brush, partially concealed but not hidden with any great care. She was unclothed. The scene told a story that investigators immediately recognized. This was not an accident, not a tragic misunderstanding. This was violence. This was intentional. The medical examiner's report confirmed what detectives already suspected. Jody had been sexually assaulted. She had been strangled. The cause of death was asphyxiation, the kind of death that is intimate and deliberate, requiring sustained pressure, sustained intent. It's a method that speaks to rage, to control, to something deeply disturbed in the person who commits it. The news devastated the community. Bellevue was not immune to crime, but this felt different. This was a young woman, taken in broad daylight from a public place. Her life ended with a brutality that seemed almost incomprehensible. Parents held their children a little tighter. Women looked over their shoulders. The sense of safety that had once defined the city began to erode. Detectives worked the case relentlessly. They processed the scene, collected evidence, interviewed hundreds of people. They looked at known offenders in the area, anyone with a history of violence against women. They developed theories, followed leads, spent thousands of hours trying to piece together what had happened. But the trail went cold. Weeks turned into months. Months turned into years. The investigation never officially closed, but without new evidence, without a breakthrough, there was only so much that could be done. Jody's case became one of those haunting unsolved mysteries, the kind that detectives carry with them, that families never stop thinking about. And for a long time, it seemed like it would remain that way. The murder of Jody Loomis cast a long shadow. It wasn't just the loss of a young life, though that alone was devastating. It was the randomness of it, the senselessness. Jody had done nothing wrong. She had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, crossed paths with someone whose darkness she couldn't have anticipated. For her family, the years that followed were a kind of limbo. There was grief, of course, profound and unrelenting. But there was also something else, a lack of closure, a sense that the story was unfinished. They didn't know who had killed Jody. They didn't know why. And without those answers, the wound never quite healed. Detectives never forgot about the case. In the world of law enforcement, certain cases stick with you. They become part of your internal landscape, revisited in quiet moments, re-examined when new techniques become available. Jody's case was one of those. Over the years, investigators would occasionally pull the file, review the evidence, see if there was something they'd missed, some new angle to pursue. But forensic science in 1980 was a different world than it is today. DNA analysis, which would later revolutionize criminal investigation, was still in its infancy. The kind of genetic testing that can now identify a suspect from a single hair or a trace of saliva simply didn't exist yet. Evidence was collected and preserved, but the tools to fully exploit that evidence weren't available. Still, investigators held on to everything. They understood that science was advancing rapidly, that methods which seemed like science fiction might one day become reality. They stored biological samples carefully, maintained meticulous records, kept the case file intact. It was an act of faith, in a way, a belief that someday, somehow, justice might still be possible. As the 1980s gave way to the 90s, and the 90s to the new millennium, Jody's case remained unsolved. New detectives inherited the file from their predecessors. The Bellevue Police Department grew and changed. The city itself continued to evolve, becoming one of the wealthiest and most technologically advanced communities in the country. But the question of what happened to Jody Loomis remained unanswered. Then, gradually, things began to change. DNA technology advanced dramatically. What had once been impossible became routine. Cold cases across the country were being reopened and solved through genetic testing. Detectives began to revisit old files with renewed hope. In 2002, the Bellevue Police Department decided to take another look at Jody's case. They submitted biological evidence collected from her body for DNA analysis. The technology had improved enough that they were able to develop a genetic profile of her killer. It was a significant breakthrough, not a name, not yet, but a genetic fingerprint that could be compared against databases. The DNA profile was entered into the Combined DNA Index System, or CODIS, a national database that allows law enforcement agencies to compare DNA evidence across jurisdictions. If the killer had been arrested elsewhere, if his DNA had been collected and entered into the system, there would be a match. But there wasn't. The profile sat in the database, waiting, a digital ghost searching for its counterpart. Years passed. The case remained active but unsolved. Detectives continued to follow up on tips, to look for connections, but without a match in CODIS, their options were limited. And then, in 2019, something extraordinary happened. A new technique emerged, something that would change the landscape of criminal investigation forever. It was called genetic genealogy, and it had already been used to solve one of the most infamous cold cases in American history, the Golden State Killer. The method was ingenious. Instead of relying solely on law enforcement databases, investigators could upload crime scene DNA to public genealogy websites, the kind used by millions of people to trace their ancestry and find distant relatives. By identifying genetic relatives of the unknown suspect and then constructing family trees, investigators could narrow down the pool of potential suspects, sometimes all the way to a single individual. It was painstaking work, requiring a combination of genetic science and old-fashioned detective work. But it was effective, and in 2019, detectives in Bellevue decided to try it. They partnered with a genetic genealogy company and uploaded the killer's DNA profile to a public database. The search began. Analysts looked for matches, for people who shared segments of DNA with the killer. They found distant cousins, then closer relatives. They built family trees, tracing lineages back through generations, then forward again to identify living descendants. It took months, but gradually the circle narrowed. Names were eliminated. New branches were explored, and eventually the genealogists identified a man they believed could be the killer. His name was Gary Hartman. Gary Hartman was 66 years old when detectives first began looking at him seriously. He lived in Lakewood, Washington, about 40 miles south of Bellevue. He was not a name that had ever come up in the original investigation. He had no prior connection to Jody Loomis, no obvious motive, no history that would have put him on law enforcement's radar in 1980. But the genetic genealogy strongly suggested he was the man they were looking for. The next step was to confirm it. Detectives began surveillance. They needed a direct DNA sample from Hartman to compare against the profile developed from the crime scene evidence. In June of 2018, they got their opportunity. Hartman was observed in public, and detectives were able to collect a discarded item that contained his DNA. Reports indicate it was a napkin from a restaurant. The sample was analyzed. The results were conclusive. Gary Hartman's DNA matched the DNA found on Jody Loomis's body. After nearly 38 years, they had their man. On June 20th, 2018, Gary Hartman was arrested and charged with first-degree murder and first-degree rape. The arrest was the result of decades of perseverance, of advances in science that no one could have imagined in 1980, and of investigators who refused to let Jody's case be forgotten. The news sent shockwaves through the community. For those who remembered Jody, who had lived with the unresolved horror of her murder for nearly 4 decades, the arrest was both a relief and a reopening of old wounds. Justice, it seemed, might finally be possible. But who was Gary Hartman? What had led him to commit such a brutal act? Investigators began to piece together his background. In 1980, he would have been 28 years old. He was married, living in the Bellevue area, working as a truck driver. On the surface, he appeared unremarkable. There was no obvious history of violence, no prior arrests for sexual assault or violent crime that would have flagged him as a suspect. This absence of a clear criminal record raised questions. Was Jody's murder an isolated incident, a single horrific act by someone who otherwise lived a normal life? Or had there been other victims, other crimes that had simply never been connected to him? Law enforcement began to look at other unsolved cases from the same time period, searching for possible links. They found none that definitively tied to Hartman, but the question lingered. The truth is, we may never know the full scope of his actions. What investigators did know was what the physical evidence told them. The DNA match was irrefutable. Gary Hartman had been there. He had assaulted Jody. He had killed her. And then he had left her body in the woods and walked away, back into his ordinary life, as if nothing had happened. The legal process began. Hartman was held on a bond of $5 million. His attorneys entered a plea of not guilty. The case moved slowly through the system, as these cases often do, with motions and hearings and endless procedural steps. For Jody's family, the wait was excruciating. They had waited 38 years for this moment. Now they would have to wait a bit longer for the trial, for the chance to face the man who had taken Jody from them and to hear him held accountable. But before the case went to trial, something significant happened. In March of 2022, Gary Hartman changed his plea. He pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and first-degree rape. It was an acknowledgement of the inescapable evidence against him, of the DNA that placed him at the scene, that connected him irrefutably to the crime. There would be no trial, no opportunity for a jury to weigh the evidence. Hartman had admitted his guilt. The sentencing hearing took place later that year. It was a moment that Jody's surviving family members had waited decades to witness. They spoke in court, describing the pain of losing Jody, the years of not knowing, the relief and anguish of finally having answers. Gary Hartman was sentenced to just over 26 years in prison. For a man in his late 60s, it was effectively a life sentence. He would spend the remainder of his years behind bars, paying for a crime he had committed when he was a younger man, a crime he had gotten away with for most of his adult life. The resolution of Jody Loomis's case did not erase the past. It did not bring her back. It did not undo the suffering of her family or the years they had spent without answers. But it did provide something that had been missing for nearly 4 decades, closure, or at least the closest thing to it that justice can offer. The case became a symbol of both the limitations and the potential of the criminal justice system. For 38 years, Jody's killer had been unknown, unreachable. The tools available to investigators in 1980 were simply not sufficient to identify him. But the persistence of law enforcement, the preservation of evidence, and the revolutionary advances in DNA technology eventually made the impossible possible. Genetic genealogy, the technique that led to Hartman's identification, has since been used to solve dozens of cold cases across the country. It represents a new frontier in criminal investigation, a way to reach back through time and bring killers to justice even when traditional methods have failed. But it also raises questions about privacy, about the use of genetic data, about where the line should be drawn between public safety and individual rights. These are important questions, ones that society is still grappling with. But for the family of Jody Loomis, the answers seem clear. This technology gave them something they had thought they would never have: the knowledge of who killed Jody and the assurance that he would be held accountable. The case also serves as a reminder of something darker and more unsettling. Gary Hartman lived an ordinary life for decades after murdering Jody. He had a family, a job, a community. He was, by all outward appearances, a regular person. This ordinariness is, in some ways, more disturbing than the crime itself. It suggests that the capacity for violence can exist beneath the most unremarkable surfaces, that the people we pass on the street, sit next to on the bus, see at the grocery store, may be carrying secrets we cannot imagine. For the people of Bellevue, Jody's case remains a part of the collective memory. Older residents remember when it happened, remember the fear it caused, the sense of vulnerability. Younger residents may only know it as a historical footnote, one tragedy among many in the long chronicle of human violence. But for those who loved Jody, who knew her as more than a name in a police file, she remains vividly present. A daughter, a friend, a young woman whose potential was stolen from her. There are questions that will never be fully answered. Why did Gary Hartman do what he did? What led him to that parking lot on that particular evening? Was it chance, or had he been watching, waiting? Did he target Jody specifically, or was she simply in the wrong place at the wrong time? Hartman has offered no public explanation. He pleaded guilty but did not provide a confession, did not speak about his motivations or his actions. And so the interior landscape of that night, the thoughts and impulses that led to Jody's death, remain largely opaque. We know what happened. We know who did it. But the why remains, in many ways, a mystery. Perhaps that's fitting. Perhaps there are some things that cannot be fully understood, some darknesses that defy explanation. The human capacity for violence is one of the most troubling aspects of our nature, and it doesn't always come with clear reasons or rational motivations. Sometimes evil is just that, evil without justification or sense. What we can do is remember. We can remember Jody Loomis not as a victim, though she was victimized, but as a person. A young woman with a future that should have unfolded differently. We can remember the investigators who refused to give up on her case, who carried her file through the years, who were there when science finally caught up with their determination. And we can remember that justice, while it may be delayed, is sometimes still possible. The case is closed now. Gary Hartman is in prison. The legal proceedings are over. But the echoes of that September evening in 1980 continue to resonate. They remind us that our actions have consequences, that the harm we do extends far beyond the immediate moment, that the search for truth and accountability is a fundamental human need. And they remind us that even in the darkest circumstances, even after decades of silence and uncertainty, there can still be answers. There can still be justice. There can still be a kind of resolution. Jody Loomis was 20 years old when she died. She should have had a lifetime ahead of her. She didn't. But her story, tragic as it is, has not been forgotten. And in that remembering, there is a kind of tribute, a way of saying that her life mattered, that her loss was not in vain, that she is still here in some way in the memories of those who loved her and in the lessons her case has taught us. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you never miss the next true crime story to help you unwind. Now, let's get into our final story. Story 4. The Silence of Spring Hill. On a warm Florida night in 1995, two young women disappeared from a neighborhood street corner. What happened in the hours that followed would become one of the most disturbing cases in Tampa Bay history. A story of shattered trust, devastating loss, and a community forever changed by unthinkable violence. Hello and welcome again. Get comfortable if you haven't already. Pull your blankets close, dim the lights, and let yourself settle in. Now, we're going to talk about something difficult, something real. A case that reminds us how fragile safety can be and how darkness sometimes hides behind the most ordinary faces. This is a story about two young women, Shannon Rose Lloyd and Renee Cuevas. Two friends, two lives full of possibility, and one terrible night that ended everything. We'll move through this carefully, respectfully. There's no need to rush. Just listen and let the story unfold the way it needs to. This isn't about shock or spectacle. It's about remembering what happened, understanding how it happened, and honoring the lives that were lost. So take a deep breath. Let your mind focus on the words. And let's begin. Spring Hill sits in Hernando County, Florida, just north of Tampa Bay. In the mid-90s, it was a sprawling suburban area. Quiet neighborhoods, strip malls, highways cutting through pine forests and palmetto scrub. It was the kind of place where families moved for affordability and space, where the streets felt safe enough to walk at night, where teenagers gathered at gas stations and fast food parking lots because there wasn't much else to do. Shannon Rose Lloyd was 20 years old in the spring of 1995. She had light brown hair, a warm smile, and a gentle way about her. Friends described her as kind, thoughtful, someone who cared deeply about the people around her. She wasn't from Spring Hill originally, but she'd found herself there, navigating life like so many young people do, working, making friends, trying to figure out what came next. Renee Cuevas was 17, dark-haired, bright-eyed, full of energy. She was still in high school, still figuring out who she was. Like Shannon, she was well-liked. People who knew her remembered her laughter, her openness, the way she could light up a room just by being herself. The two women knew each other, though they weren't lifelong friends. They'd met through mutual acquaintances, the way people often do in smaller communities. They'd crossed paths at parties, through shared social circles. They were comfortable with each other, trusted each other. On the night of May 26, 1995, they were together. It was a Friday. The air was thick with humidity, the kind of sticky warmth that clings to your skin in Florida as spring slides into summer. Shannon and Renee had spent the evening out, socializing, doing what young people do on a Friday night. Nothing unusual, nothing remarkable. Around midnight, they found themselves on Mariner Boulevard, one of the main roads running through Spring Hill. They were waiting for a ride, for someone to pick them up and take them home. They stood under the glow of streetlights, talking, laughing maybe, watching cars pass by. It should have been safe. Should have been fine. And then a vehicle pulled over. The driver was someone they recognized, someone they knew, not a stranger, not some shadowy figure from a horror story, just a man they'd met before, someone they had no reason to fear. His name was Robert Mitchell. He was in his early 20s, lived in the area, moved in similar social circles. He'd been friendly with them before. There was no reason to think this ride would be any different from any other ride they might have accepted from someone they knew. So they got in. Shannon climbed into the front seat. Renee settled into the back. The doors closed. The vehicle pulled away from the curb and disappeared into the night. And that was the last time anyone saw them alive. Robert Mitchell wasn't a stranger to law enforcement. He had a history, nothing violent at that point, but enough to put him on people's radar. Small crimes, bad decisions, the kind of pattern that suggested someone who didn't always make good choices, who didn't always think about consequences. But nobody expected what was about to happen. Nobody could have predicted that this ordinary Friday night would become something unspeakable. The hours that followed are difficult to piece together even now. What we know comes from evidence, from forensic analysis, from statements Mitchell himself would eventually make. But in those dark hours between midnight and dawn, something went terribly, horribly wrong. Mitchell didn't take Shannon and Renee home. He didn't drive them where they needed to go. Instead, he took them somewhere isolated, somewhere away from the lights and traffic of Mariner Boulevard, somewhere no one could hear them. What happened next is almost unbearable to consider. Shannon and Renee were subjected to a nightmare. They were assaulted, brutalized, terrorized. The details are too graphic for this kind of telling, but we need to understand the gravity of what occurred. These weren't abstract victims. They were real people experiencing real terror, real pain, real desperation. And then Robert Mitchell made sure they would never tell anyone what he'd done. He ended their lives, violently, deliberately, and then he tried to make them disappear. When Saturday morning came, Shannon and Renee didn't come home. Phone calls went unanswered. Plans were missed. Families started to worry. By Saturday afternoon, those worries had turned to panic. Shannon's family contacted the Hernando County Sheriff's Office. So did Renee's. Missing persons reports were filed. Descriptions were given. Recent photographs were handed over. The machinery of a missing persons investigation began to turn. Detectives started retracing the young women's movements. They talked to friends, to people who'd seen them Friday night. They learned about the gathering, about the wait for a ride on Mariner Boulevard. And they learned about Robert Mitchell. Multiple witnesses mentioned him. He'd been around that night. He'd been seen talking to Shannon and Renee. He'd offered them a ride. When investigators went looking for Mitchell, they found him quickly. He was still in the area, still going about his business as if nothing had happened. But when they started asking questions, something didn't add up. His story kept changing. He was evasive, defensive. He gave conflicting accounts of where he'd been, what he'd done, who he'd seen. Detectives knew they were looking at someone with something to hide. The question was what and how bad. On Sunday, May 28th, just 2 days after Shannon and Renee had disappeared, investigators made a discovery that confirmed their worst fears. In a wooded area in Hernando County, not far from Spring Hill, they found 2 bodies. Shannon Rose Lloyd and Renee Cuevas had been discarded like garbage, hidden among the trees and undergrowth. The medical examiner would later confirm what detectives already suspected. They'd been attacked, assaulted, and then killed. Their bodies showed signs of trauma that spoke to the violence they'd endured before death. It was a crime scene that seasoned investigators would struggle to forget. The kind of thing that stays with you, that changes how you see the world. And at the center of it all was Robert Mitchell. The discovery of Shannon's and Renee's bodies transformed the investigation from a missing persons case into a double homicide. The Hernando County Sheriff's Office threw resources at it immediately. This wasn't just any case. This was 2 young women, assaulted and killed by someone they trusted enough to get into a vehicle with. The community was horrified. The media was paying attention. There was pressure to solve this quickly. But in some ways, the case was already solved. Robert Mitchell had been one of the last people seen with the victims. His stories didn't match. His behavior was suspicious. Still, detectives needed evidence. They needed to build a case that would hold up in court, that would ensure justice for Shannon and Renee. They started with Mitchell's vehicle. When they examined it, they found exactly what they were looking for: forensic evidence linking Shannon and Renee to the interior of the car. Hair fibers, trace evidence, things that proved the young women had been inside that vehicle, just as witnesses had said. But there was more, much more. Detectives discovered blood evidence, DNA evidence, material that connected Mitchell not just to the victim's presence in his vehicle, but to the violence that had been inflicted on them. Mitchell was brought in for questioning. This time, there was no casual conversation, no vague questions about his whereabouts. This was a formal interrogation. Detectives laid out what they knew. They showed him the evidence. They explained how trapped he was, how there was no way out of this. And slowly, piece by piece, Robert Mitchell's story began to crumble. He tried denial first, said he didn't know anything, said he'd given them a ride and dropped them off, that he hadn't seen them after that. But when confronted with the forensic evidence, with the impossibility of that story, he shifted tactics. He started making admissions, Small ones at first, then bigger ones. Eventually, he confessed. Robert Mitchell's confession was chilling in its matter-of-factness. He described picking up Shannon and Renee, just as witnesses had said. He described driving them away from Mariner Boulevard, taking them to a secluded location. He admitted to assaulting them, to attacking them, to taking their lives. He tried to minimize it, to make it sound like things had gotten out of hand, like it wasn't planned. But the evidence told a different story. This hadn't been some spontaneous loss of control. This had been deliberate, calculated. Mitchell had known what he was doing at every step. He'd taken two young women who trusted him, who thought they were just getting a safe ride home, and he'd turned their final hours into a nightmare. For investigators, the confession was both a relief and a horror. Relief because it meant they had what they needed to pursue charges, to hold Mitchell accountable. Horror because hearing someone describe what they'd done, hearing the details spoken out loud, was almost unbearable. But they kept going. They documented everything. They gathered every piece of evidence, every statement, every forensic finding. They built their case meticulously, knowing that the families of Shannon and Renee deserved nothing less than absolute thoroughness. While detectives worked, the families of Shannon Rose Lloyd and Renee Cuevas were living through something no family should ever have to endure. They'd gone from worry to grief in the space of 48 hours. From hoping their daughters were just out somewhere, maybe staying with friends, to learning that those daughters were dead, taken, destroyed by someone they'd had no reason to fear. Shannon's family remembered her kindness, her gentle nature. They thought about all the conversations they'd never have, all the moments they'd never share. Birthdays, holidays, weddings, children, all of it gone, erased by one man's terrible choices. Renee's family faced the same unbearable loss. She'd been so young, with so much life ahead of her. She'd been full of plans, full of dreams. Now there was nothing but absence, nothing but the awful knowledge of how she'd spent her final hours. The community rallied around both families. Vigils were held. Memorial services were organized. People who'd known Shannon and Renee came together to remember them, to honor them, to insist that their lives had mattered, that they were more than just victims of a horrible crime. But beneath the support and sympathy, there was anger too. Anger at Robert Mitchell, obviously, but also questions about how this could have happened. How could someone like Mitchell have been walking around freely? How could he have seemed so normal, so unremarkable? It's a question that comes up in almost every case like this. The neighbors always say the same thing. He seems so normal. I never would have guessed. But that's the thing about violence. It doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it hides behind an ordinary face, an ordinary life. Sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones you'd never suspect. As the investigation continued, more details emerged about Robert Mitchell's background. He'd grown up in the area, had attended local schools. He had family in the region. On paper, he looked like any other young man trying to make his way in the world. But there were warning signs. Friends and acquaintances who looked back on their interactions with Mitchell after the arrest started remembering things. Little moments that hadn't seemed significant at the time, but that took on new meaning in hindsight. He'd always had a temper, some said. He could be controlling, possessive. He didn't handle rejection well. He had issues with women, with authority, with anyone who challenged him. None of it had seemed particularly alarming in isolation. Plenty of people have tempers. Plenty of people struggle with relationships. But taken together, in the context of what he'd done to Shannon and Renee, those traits formed a picture of someone who'd been capable of terrible violence all along. The psychological question, why he did what he did, was something prosecutors would explore later. But in those early days of the investigation, the focus was simply on building an airtight case. By early June, less than 2 weeks after Shannon and Renee had disappeared, Robert Mitchell was formally charged with 2 counts of first-degree homicide, 2 counts of sexual battery, and multiple related charges. He was taken into custody without bail. There would be no walking free, no second chances. He would stay behind bars while the legal process moved forward. For the families, the arrest brought a small measure of relief. At least he couldn't hurt anyone else. At least they knew who was responsible. But it didn't bring Shannon and Renee back. It didn't undo the horror of what had happened. Justice, when it came, would be cold comfort at best. The state attorney's office for Florida's 5th Judicial Circuit took on the prosecution of Robert Mitchell with the seriousness the case demanded. This was a death penalty case. 2 victims, both young women, both subjected to unthinkable violence before their deaths. The aggravating factors were overwhelming. Assistant state attorneys prepared meticulously. They reviewed every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every forensic report. They consulted with experts on DNA analysis, on bloodstain patterns, on the mechanics of violent crime. They talked to the medical examiner about the injuries Shannon and Renee had sustained, about what those injuries revealed about the sequence of events. And they prepared to present all of it to a jury to make 12 strangers understand the magnitude of what Robert Mitchell had done. The defense, for their part, faced an almost impossible task. Mitchell had confessed. The physical evidence was damning. There was no credible way to argue innocence. Instead, the defense strategy focused on avoiding the death penalty. They would argue for life in prison instead, would try to present mitigating factors that might convince a jury to show mercy where their client had shown none. The trial began in 1996, about a year after the crimes. The Hernando County Courthouse became the center of intense public attention. Reporters filled the gallery. Shannon's and Renee's families attended every day, sitting through testimony that must have been agonizing to hear. Robert Mitchell sat at the defense table, watching it all unfold with an expression that witnesses described as blank, detached, as if he were observing something happening to someone else. The prosecution's case unfolded methodically. They started with the timeline, establishing where Shannon and Renee had been that Friday night, who they'd been with, how they'd ended up waiting for a ride on Mariner Boulevard. Then came the witnesses, friends who'd seen Shannon and Renee with Mitchell, people who'd watched them get into his vehicle, people who remembered thinking at the time that it seemed fine, that there was no reason to worry. The guilt some of those witnesses felt was palpable. They'd known Mitchell. They'd thought he was safe. They'd watched Shannon and Renee drive away to their deaths and hadn't realized anything was wrong until it was far too late. Then came the evidence. Forensic experts testified about the material found in Mitchell's vehicle. Hair samples matching Shannon and Renee, fibers from their clothing, blood evidence that had been cleaned but not completely removed, still detectable with luminol and other chemical reagents. DNA experts explained how genetic material from the victims had been found on Mitchell, and how genetic material from Mitchell had been found on the victims. The science was clear. The connections were undeniable. The medical examiner testified about the autopsies. This was perhaps the most difficult testimony for the families to endure. The examiner described the injuries Shannon and Renee had sustained, the blunt force trauma, the evidence of assault, the manner of death. It was clinical, professional, but underneath the medical terminology was the terrible reality. Shannon and Renee had suffered. They'd known what was happening to them. They died in fear and pain. And then came Mitchell's confession. Detectives who'd interviewed him testified about the interrogation. They described how Mitchell's story had changed, how he'd eventually admitted to the attacks, how he described what he'd done with an eerie lack of emotion. The confession was played for the jury. Mitchell's voice filled the courtroom, describing the night of May 26th, admitting to the violence, confirming what the physical evidence had already proven. It was devastating testimony. Several jurors were visibly shaken. Some of Shannon's and Renee's family members left the courtroom, unable to listen any longer. The defense put up what fight they could. They didn't dispute the basic facts, they couldn't. Instead, they tried to paint Mitchell as someone who'd made a terrible mistake, someone who'd been under the influence of substances, someone whose judgment had been impaired. They brought in witnesses who testified about Mitchell's difficult childhood, about trauma he'd experienced, about mental health struggles. It was the kind of mitigation you see in capital cases, the attempt to humanize the defendant, to give the jury a reason to spare his life even if they couldn't excuse his actions. But the prosecution's rebuttal was simple and powerful. Nothing in Robert Mitchell's past justified what he'd done to Shannon Rose Lloyd and Renee Cuevas. Nothing excused the premeditated violence, the calculated cruelty, the complete disregard for human life. Closing arguments were emotional on both sides. The prosecution reminded the jury of Shannon and Renee, their youth, their potential, their trust. They reminded the jury of the evidence, of the confession, of the absolute certainty of Mitchell's guilt. They asked for justice, for accountability, for a verdict that would reflect the severity of the crimes. The defense made their final plea for mercy, arguing that life in prison without parole would be punishment enough, that execution was not necessary. The jury deliberated for less than a full day. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous on all counts. Guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Shannon Rose Lloyd. Guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Renee Cuevas. Guilty of sexual battery against Shannon Rose Lloyd. Guilty of sexual battery against Renee Cuevas. Guilty on every single charge the state had brought. The courtroom erupted in quiet tears and relieved embraces. Shannon's and Renee's families held each other, some crying, some simply sitting in stunned silence. Robert Mitchell showed no reaction. He stared straight ahead, expressionless, as the verdicts were read. The penalty phase came next. This was where the jury would decide whether Mitchell would receive the death penalty or life in prison without the possibility of parole. The prosecution argued that the aggravating factors, multiple victims, the sexual violence, the premeditated nature of the crimes, warranted the ultimate punishment. The defense made their case for life imprisonment, arguing that Mitchell could be incarcerated forever without taking his life. The jury deliberated again, and again their decision was swift. Robert Mitchell was sentenced to death. Twice. One death sentence for Shannon Rose Lloyd. One death sentence for Renee Cuevas. The judge accepted the jury's recommendation and formally imposed the sentences. Mitchell would be transferred to Florida State Prison to death row, where he would await execution. For Shannon's and Renee's families, the verdict brought a measure of closure. Not peace, there could be no real peace after such a loss, but at least the knowledge that the justice system had worked, that Mitchell would be held accountable, that he would never hurt anyone else. Robert Mitchell entered Florida's death row system in 1996. He would remain there for years, going through the lengthy appeals process that accompanies every capital conviction. His lawyers filed motion after motion, challenging various aspects of the trial, the evidence, the sentencing. This is standard in death penalty cases. The system is designed to ensure that every possible error is examined, that no innocent person is executed, that due process is followed meticulously. But in Mitchell's case, the appeals went nowhere. The evidence was too strong, the confession too clear, the trial too properly conducted. Every court that reviewed the case upheld the convictions and the sentences. Years passed. Shannon's and Renee's families tried to rebuild their lives around the absence of their daughters. They attended parole hearings. Not for Mitchell, who would never be eligible for parole, but for the process to make sure their voices were heard, to remind everyone who listened what had been taken from them. They started foundations in Shannon's and Renee's names. They advocated for victims' rights, for better education about personal safety, for resources for families dealing with violent crime. They turned their grief into purpose, because that's what survivors do. They find ways to keep living, to honor the dead by making the world a little bit better, a little bit safer. In 2015, 20 years after the murders, Robert Mitchell's appeals were finally exhausted. The courts had ruled, again and again, that his convictions and sentences were valid. There was nothing left to challenge, no procedural error to exploit. An execution date was scheduled. When the news reached Shannon's and Renee's families, they faced a new kind of turmoil. For some, the approaching execution brought relief. Finally, after 2 decades, the sentence would be carried out. Justice would be complete. For others, it brought complicated emotions. Grief renewed. Questions about whether execution really brought closure or just added more death to death. But whatever their personal feelings, they all agreed on one thing. Robert Mitchell deserved to be held accountable for what he'd done. Whether that meant execution or life imprisonment, he deserved to lose his freedom, his future the way Shannon and Renee had lost theirs. On September 10th, 2015, Robert Mitchell was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. He was 42 years old. In the days leading up to the execution, there were the usual debates about capital punishment. Advocates argued that Mitchell's crimes were exactly the kind that warranted the death penalty. Opponents argued that execution solved nothing, that it was state-sanctioned killing that diminished us all. Mitchell himself gave a final statement. It was brief, reportedly expressing remorse for his actions, acknowledging the pain he'd caused Shannon's and Renee's families. Whether that remorse was genuine or performative, no one could say for certain. But it didn't change what he'd done. It didn't bring Shannon and Renee back. At 6:13 in the evening, after the chemical sequence had been administered, Robert Mitchell was pronounced dead. Shannon's and Renee's families were present, watching through the glass of the witness room. Some felt a sense of closure. Others felt only sadness. Not for Mitchell, but for all the life that had been wasted, all the pain that had been caused, all the years they'd spent waiting for this moment. In the aftermath of Mitchell's execution, there was reflection on what the case meant, what lessons could be drawn from it. For law enforcement, it was a reminder of the importance of thorough investigation, of following evidence wherever it leads, of building cases that can withstand scrutiny. For the community, it was a painful lesson about trust and vulnerability. Shannon and Renee had gotten into a vehicle with someone they knew, someone they had no reason to fear. And that trust had been violated in the worst possible way. It raised questions that have no easy answers. How do we balance openness and caution? How do we teach young people to trust their instincts without making them afraid of everyone? How do we live in a world where violence can come from the most unexpected places? Today, more than 25 years after their deaths, Shannon Rose Lloyd and Renee Cuevas are remembered not just as victims, but as individuals. As daughters, friends, young women with dreams and personalities and people who love them. Their families keep their memories alive. They share stories about who Shannon and Renee were before that terrible night. They talk about Shannon's kindness, Renee's laughter, the little moments that made them who they were. Because that's important. It's easy in true crime to focus so much on the violence, on the darkness, that we forget about the people at the center of these stories. We reduce them to names in a case file, to tragic figures in a narrative. But Shannon and Renee were so much more than that. They were real. They mattered. Their lives had value beyond the manner of their deaths. The case remains one of the most notorious in Hernando County history. It's talked about in law enforcement circles as an example of how circumstantial evidence, forensic science, and old-fashioned detective work can come together to solve even the most horrific crimes. It's studied in criminal justice courses as a case study in interrogation techniques, in building capital cases, in navigating the complexities of the death penalty system. And it's remembered by the community as a reminder that darkness can touch anyone, anywhere, at any time, but also as a reminder of resilience, of families who survived the worst thing imaginable and found ways to keep going, of investigators who never stopped working until they had answers, of a justice system that, whatever its flaws, sometimes gets things right. As we come to the end of the story, it's worth sitting with the weight of it for a moment. Two young women, full of life and possibility, got into a car on a Friday night in May. They trusted the wrong person, and because of that trust, they never made it home. Their families have lived with that loss every single day for more than 25 years. Every birthday missed, every holiday celebrated without them, every milestone, graduations, weddings, grandchildren, that Shannon and Renee will never experience. Robert Mitchell took all of that from them. And while he's gone now, executed for his crimes, that doesn't undo the damage. It doesn't fill the absence. But we can remember. We can honor Shannon Rose Lloyd and Renee Cuevas by refusing to forget them, by insisting that their lives mattered, by telling their story with the respect and dignity they deserved. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you never miss the next true crime story to help you unwind. Now, let's get into our final story. Story 5. The Tobacconist's Secret. The Peacock Murders of 1946. In the winter of 1946, two elderly shopkeepers locked their store for the night, walked upstairs to their modest flat, and were never seen alive again. What happened in those quiet rooms above a London tobacconist would remain hidden for days, concealed behind locked doors and drawn curtains, until a worried nephew broke through to discover a scene that would haunt investigators for decades. This is the story of George and Catherine Peacock, and the betrayal that came from the one place they never expected. Now, we're going back to post-war London, to a time when the city was still rebuilding itself, still nursing wounds from years of bombing raids and rationing. It was a period of exhaustion and hope existing side by side. People were trying to return to normal life, whatever that meant anymore. In this landscape of recovery, we meet two people who had spent their lives building something small but significant. A tobacco shop, a modest income, a quiet existence. George and Catherine Peacock were not wealthy, but they were comfortable. They were not famous, but they were known in their neighborhood. And they were not young, which made what happened to them feel even more senseless, even more cruel. This is not a story about dramatic violence or shocking revelations, though both are present. Instead, it's about something quieter and perhaps more disturbing. The erosion of trust, the weight of secrets, and how desperation can transform familiar faces into something unrecognizable. So find a comfortable position, let the world fade a bit, and listen. Because tonight, we're going to walk through the final days of two lives that ended far too soon, and examine how justice, when it finally arrived, brought neither comfort nor clarity to anyone involved. Let's begin. George Henry Peacock was 70 years old in 1946. His wife, Catherine, was 67. They had been married for most of their adult lives, and together they ran a small tobacconist shop at 106 Westbourne Park Road, in the Notting Hill area of London. It wasn't a glamorous location. Westbourne Park Road was a working-class street, lined with terraced houses and small shops that served the daily needs of local residents. The Peacock's shop occupied the ground floor of a narrow building, and above it, reached by a staircase inside, was their flat. It was a common arrangement in those days. You worked downstairs, lived upstairs, and the boundary between business and home was thin. The shop itself was modest. Tobacco products, cigarettes, matches, perhaps some sweets and newspapers. Nothing expensive, nothing that would draw attention. George handled most of the shop duties, though Catherine helped when needed. They were quiet people, known for being polite but reserved. Neighbors would nod to them in passing, make small purchases, exchange a few words about the weather or the latest news. But the Peacocks kept to themselves mostly, which was not unusual for people of their generation. They had no children of their own, but George had a nephew named Walter Henry Peacock, known as Wally to the family. Wally was 24 years old in 1946, recently returned from military service like so many young men of that time. The war had ended, but the adjustment to peacetime was proving difficult for many veterans. Jobs were scarce, housing was scarce, money was scarce. Wally lived not far from his uncle and aunt, and he visited them occasionally, though the relationship was not particularly warm. There was also a woman named Lillian Rose Turner, known to friends as Lily. She was 29 years old, unmarried, and worked various jobs around London. Lily and Wally had become involved with each other, though the nature of their relationship was complicated, marked by financial struggles and a shared sense of desperation about their futures. The winter of 1946 was a cold one. Rationing was still in effect. Coal was scarce. People were tired, ground down by years of hardship. In this atmosphere, the Peacocks continued their routine, opening the shop each morning, serving customers throughout the day, closing up in the evening, climbing the stairs to their flat, locking the door behind them. It was a pattern they had followed for years, a safe pattern, predictable one. But by early February of 1946, that pattern was about to be shattered in the most terrible way. On the evening of February the 6th, 1946, the shop closed as usual. George locked the front door, turned the sign to closed, and he and Catherine went upstairs. It was a Wednesday unremarkable in every way. The street outside grew quiet as darkness settled over London. No one saw the peacocks again. At first, this wasn't particularly alarming. The shop remained closed on Thursday, February the 7th, but shops did close occasionally for various reasons. Perhaps one of them was ill. Perhaps they had gone to visit someone. The neighbors noticed, but no one thought to investigate immediately. By Friday, concern began to creep in. The shop was still closed, the curtains in the flat above still drawn. This was unusual. George was a creature of habit, and missing 2 days of business was not like him. A few people knocked on the door. No answer. They called up to the windows. Nothing. Saturday came and went. Still no sign of the peacocks. The milk bottles were piling up on the doorstep, a clear indication that something was wrong. In those days, milk was delivered daily, and undisturbed bottles were one of the most reliable signals of trouble. By Sunday, February the 10th, Wally Peacock had been informed that his uncle and aunt had not been seen for several days. He made his way to Westbourne Park Road, troubled by the news. When he arrived, he found the shop locked, the flat silent. He knocked repeatedly, called out their names, peered through windows. Nothing. Something was very wrong. Wally tried the door, but it was locked from inside. He went around to the back of the building, searching for another way in, but found nothing accessible. Finally, with the help of a neighbor, he forced entry through a rear window. The shop itself appeared normal. Stock on the shelves, everything in its place. But there was an odd smell in the air, faint but unmistakable to anyone who has encountered it before. The smell of death. Wally climbed the stairs to the flat above, his heart pounding now, dreading what he might find. The door to the sitting room was closed. He opened it. Inside, he found his uncle and aunt. George Peacock was lying on the floor, partially hidden beneath furniture that had been moved or overturned. Catherine was nearby, her body positioned in a way that suggested she had tried to defend herself or flee. Both had been dead for days. The room showed signs of violence. Furniture was disturbed. Objects were scattered. It was clear that something brutal had occurred here, something that had ended 2 lives in a space that should have been safe, in a home they had occupied for years. Wally backed out of the room and ran to call the police. Within the hour, Westbourne Park Road was filled with police vehicles. Officers cordoned off the shop and the flat above. Detectives from Scotland Yard arrived to oversee what was clearly a murder investigation. The scene told a story, but it was a story full of gaps and questions. Dr. Keith Simpson, one of the most respected forensic pathologists in Britain at the time, was called to examine the bodies. His findings were meticulous. George Peacock had died from multiple blows to the head, delivered with significant force. Catherine had also suffered severe head injuries. The murder weapon appeared to be something heavy and blunt, possibly a hammer or similar tool, though no weapon was found at the scene. The estimated time of death was approximately 4 to 5 days prior, which placed the murders on Wednesday evening, February the 6th, or very early Thursday morning, February the 7th. This aligned with the last confirmed sightings of the Peacocks closing their shop on Wednesday evening. There was no sign of forced entry from outside. The front door had been locked from the inside. The windows were secure. This suggested that whoever killed the Peacocks had either been let in willingly or had access to the premises in some other way. The flat itself had been ransacked, but in a peculiar manner. Drawers had been pulled open, papers scattered, but the disruption seemed half-hearted, as though the person searching had either found what they wanted quickly or had been interrupted. It was not the work of a professional burglar, detectives noted. It looked amateurish, panicked. Money was missing from the flat, though the exact amount was difficult to determine. George was known to keep cash on hand, both for the shop and for personal use. It appeared that whoever had killed the Peacocks had taken whatever money they could find. The investigation immediately focused on a few key questions. Who had access to the flat? Who knew about the Peacocks' habits and routines? who might have been desperate enough to commit murder for what was likely a modest sum of money. Detectives began interviewing neighbors, customers, anyone who had regular contact with the Peacocks. Most reported the same thing. The couple was quiet, private, caused no trouble. No one had heard sounds of a struggle on Wednesday night, but given the thick walls of these old buildings and the fact that many people went to bed early, this wasn't surprising. Attention turned to family members. George's nephew, Wally Peacock, had been the one to discover the bodies. This was noted. In murder investigations, especially those involving elderly victims, family members are often scrutinized first. Financial motives, inheritance disputes, personal grievances, these are common threads in domestic homicides. Wally was brought in for questioning. He was cooperative, but detectives noticed inconsistencies in his account. He claimed he had last seen his uncle and aunt several weeks prior, but other witnesses placed him much closer to the scene around the time of the murders. When pressed, Wally became evasive, nervous. Detectives dug deeper into Wally's life. What they found painted a picture of a young man struggling significantly. He had no steady employment. He was living hand to mouth, moving between lodgings, borrowing money where he could. He had a girlfriend, Lillian Turner, who was in similar circumstances. Lily was also brought in for questioning. She was a thin woman, worn down by poverty and poor health, with a nervous demeanor that made her seem younger than her 29 years. When asked about her whereabouts on the night of February the 6th, she gave vague answers. She couldn't provide a solid alibi. Neither could Wally. As detectives continued to investigate, a picture began to emerge. Wally and Lily had been seen together near Westbourne Park Road on the evening of February the 6th. Multiple witnesses reported this. One neighbor recalled seeing a couple matching their description standing outside the Peacock's shop just after closing time, as though waiting for something. Then there was the matter of money. In the days immediately following the murders, both Wally and Lily had suddenly acquired cash. Lily had paid off debts she'd been carrying for weeks. Wally had purchased new clothes, spent money on drinks at a pub. When asked where this money came from, both gave contradictory explanations. Forensic evidence was examined carefully. Traces of blood were found on clothing belonging to both Wally and Lily, though both claimed the blood came from innocent sources, a nosebleed, a cut finger. But the blood type matched that of the victims. The detectives pressed harder. They separated Wally and Lily, questioning them in different rooms, looking for cracks in their stories. And slowly, those cracks began to appear. Lily, under sustained questioning, broke first. She admitted that she and Wally had been at the shop on the evening of February the 6th. She admitted they had gone upstairs to the flat. But she insisted she had not participated in the violence, that Wally had done it all, that she had only been present, frozen in shock. According to Lily's statement, they had gone to the Peacock's flat with the intention of asking for money. Wally's uncle had helped him financially in the past, though always reluctantly. But this time George had refused. An argument had erupted. Wally had become enraged, grabbing a hammer that George kept for small repairs around the shop. Before Lily could process what was happening, Wally had struck his uncle repeatedly, and when Catherine tried to intervene, he had turned on her as well. Lily claimed she had begged Wally to stop, but he had been in a frenzy. Afterwards, in shock, she had helped him search the flat for money. They had taken what they could find. Somewhere between 50 and 100 pounds, a substantial sum for working-class people in 1946, and fled. When confronted with Lily's statement, Wally initially denied everything. But faced with the accumulating evidence and the detailed account from his accomplice, he eventually confessed as well. His version differed slightly from Lily's. He claimed the violence had been unplanned, that he had panicked when his uncle refused him money, that he hadn't meant to kill them both. But the essential facts aligned with what Lily had described. On February the 20th, 1946, just 10 days after the bodies were discovered, Walter Henry Peacock and Lillian Rose Turner were formally charged with the murders of George and Catherine Peacock. The trial of Wally Peacock and Lily Turner opened at the Old Bailey in April of 1946. It was not a highly publicized case. London had seen so much death during the war years that even a double murder could fade into the background unless there were particularly sensational elements. But for those who followed it, the case offered a grim window into the desperation that gripped so many in the aftermath of the war. The prosecution was led by a seasoned barrister who laid out a straightforward case. Motive: money, opportunity, access to the victims and knowledge of their habits. Evidence: forensic traces, witness statements, the suspect's own inconsistent accounts, and sudden acquisition of cash immediately after the murders. Dr. Keith Simpson testified about the nature of the injuries, the force required to inflict them, the probable sequence of events. His testimony was clinical and devastating. The victims had not died quickly. They had suffered multiple blows, suggesting a sustained attack rather than a single moment of violence. Neighbors testified about seeing Wally and Lily near the shop on the night in question. Shopkeepers testified about the sudden appearance of money in the days after the murders. The forensic evidence was presented carefully. The blood traces, the lack of forced entry, the state of the flat. Then came the confessions. Both had been given voluntarily, though Lily's legal team attempted to argue that she had been coerced or misled during questioning. This argument did not gain much traction. The confessions were detailed and consistent with the physical evidence. Lily took the stand in her own defense. She was a pitiful figure in the witness box, speaking in a quiet voice, often in tears. Her defense strategy was to position herself as a passive bystander, someone who had been horrified by Wally's actions but too frightened to intervene or report the crime afterwards. She painted herself as under Wally's influence, financially and emotionally dependent on him, trapped by circumstances. The prosecution tore this narrative apart. Why had she helped search the flat for money if she had been so horrified? Why had she spent that money freely in the days after the murders? Why had she not gone to the police once she was away from Wally's immediate presence? Lily had no good answers. She wept. She claimed she had been in shock. She insisted she was not a violent person. But her actions spoke louder than her words. Wally also testified. He was less emotional than Lily, more defiant. He admitted to striking his uncle but claimed it had been in the heat of an argument, not premeditated. He claimed Catherine's death had been an accident, that she had gotten in the way. He tried to minimize the violence, to suggest it had been less brutal than the forensic evidence indicated. Again, the prosecution methodically dismantled these claims. The number of blows, the force behind them, the fact that both victims had sustained multiple injuries. None of this supported the idea of an accident or a momentary loss of control. The defense for both defendants argued that neither had intended to kill, that the charges should be reduced to manslaughter. But the jury was not persuaded. The evidence of planning, going to the flat together, bringing or using a weapon, searching for money afterwards, disposing of evidence, all pointed to a level of intent that went beyond a sudden quarrel. The trial lasted just over a week. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. On April the 24th, 1946, both Walter Henry Peacock and Lillian Rose Turner were found guilty of murder. Under British law at the time, there was only one sentence for murder: death. The judge, wearing the traditional black cap, pronounced the sentence. Both defendants would be hanged by the neck until dead. Lily collapsed in the dock. Wally stared straight ahead, his face drained of color. Appeals were filed almost immediately, as was standard in capital cases. Both Wally and Lily's legal teams argued that the evidence had been insufficient for a murder conviction, that the jury had not been properly instructed on the possibility of manslaughter, that the confessions should not have been admitted. Every appeal was denied. By the standards of the time, the case against them was overwhelming. 2 people had been brutally killed in their own home by individuals who had access to that home, who had motive to steal from them, who had been seen near the scene at the relevant time, and who had confessed to the crime. The legal system saw no reason to intervene. But as the execution dates approached, a debate began to emerge about Lily's role and culpability. She had not wielded the hammer. By her own account, and even by Wally's, she had not struck either victim. Should she face the same punishment as the person who had actually committed the violence? This was not an uncommon dilemma in cases involving multiple defendants. The law recognized degrees of participation, principal actors versus accessories. But in a murder committed during a robbery, all participants could be held equally responsible under the felony murder rule. Public opinion was divided. Some argued that Lily had been complicit, that her presence and her actions afterwards made her equally guilty. Others felt that executing a woman who had not personally killed anyone was excessive, particularly given her apparent subordinate role in the relationship with Wally. Petitions for clemency were submitted on Lily's behalf. Her family, such as it was, pleaded for mercy. Women's groups argued that she had been a victim of circumstance and male domination. The Home Secretary reviewed the case carefully. In June of 1946, a decision was announced. Lily Turner's sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. She would not hang. Wally Peacock's sentence stood. On the morning of July the 9th, 1946, Walter Henry Peacock was executed at Pentonville Prison. He was 24 years old. Albert Pierrepoint, Britain's chief executioner, carried out the sentence with his usual swift efficiency. The entire procedure, from the moment Pierrepoint entered Wally's cell to the moment the trapdoor opened, took less than 10 seconds. Wally Peacock dropped through the trapdoor and died instantly of a broken neck, as was intended. His body was left hanging for the statutory hour, then taken down and buried in an unmarked grave within the prison grounds, as was the practice for executed criminals. Lily Turner disappeared into the prison system. She served her sentence at Holloway Prison, the main facility for female convicts in Britain. Records from this period are sparse, but it appears she was a model prisoner, quiet and compliant. She was eventually released on parole in the early 1960s, having served approximately 15 years. After her release, she vanished from public record entirely. Whether she changed her name, moved away, or simply lived quietly until her death is unknown. The Peacock's shop on Westbourne Park Road remained closed for some time after the murders. Eventually, it was sold and converted into something else, its connection to the tragedy gradually forgotten by all but those who had lived through it. There was no mystery about what had happened to George and Catherine Peacock. No lingering questions about who killed them or why. The case was solved quickly, the perpetrators caught and punished according to the law of the time. But in another sense, nothing about the case felt resolved. What drives a young man to murder his own uncle and that uncle's wife for what amounted to a few pounds? What combination of desperation, moral weakness, and circumstance transforms someone from a struggling veteran into a killer? And what responsibility does society bear when poverty and hopelessness push people toward unthinkable acts? These questions haunted observers of the case then, and they remain relevant now. The Peacock murders were not the product of evil in any abstract sense. They were the product of very specific conditions: economic hardship, lack of opportunity, the grinding poverty that afflicted so many in the aftermath of the war. This doesn't excuse what Wally and Lily did. George and Catherine Peacock were innocent victims who died terribly in their own home, killed by people they had tried to help in the past. Nothing can justify or minimize that, but it does provide context. And context, while it doesn't change the outcome, helps us understand how such tragedies occur and how they might be prevented in the future. The Peacocks are buried together in a cemetery in West London. Their grave is modest, marked with a simple stone bearing their names and dates. Few people visit it now. Time has moved on, as it always does. But their story remains, preserved in court documents and newspaper archives and fading memories. It serves as a reminder of how fragile life can be, how trust can be betrayed, and how desperation can corrupt even the most basic human bonds. George was 70. Catherine was 67. They had worked hard all their lives, survived the war, and were looking forward to whatever peaceful years remained to them. They deserved better than the death they received. Their nephew, who should have been part of their legacy, instead became their murderer. And in doing so, he destroyed not only their lives but his own. There are no winners in stories like this. No satisfying conclusions. Just loss, waste, and the cold machinery of justice grinding forward, doing what it can with broken pieces. Thank you for watching and being part of this dive into the dark and fascinating stories that keep us all on edge. If you enjoyed the ride, remember to like, subscribe, and share with others who crave a good mystery. Tell us where you're watching from. I love knowing where in the world our true crime family is tuning in. Your presence means a lot. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and keep digging into the shadows where truth and mystery meet.